Welcome everyone to the launch of Justice in a Time of Austerity, Stories from a System in Crisis by Jon Robbins and Daniel Newman. I'm Chris Minnick of Legal Aid Practitioners Group, and I'm delighted to be joined by the book's two authors and by a number of those who shared their experiences and the experiences of their clients and constituents with Jon and Dan as they researched the book. Legal Aid Practitioners Group is a membership organisation which represents practitioners on the legal aid front line. As this book details, access to publicly funded advice and representation, of which legal aid is an important pillar, has been eviscerated by a decade of austerity politics and what has euphemistically been described as indifference, and probably more accurately described as a deliberate and calculated dismantling. This is a book which therefore speaks to the very core of what we do and why our members strive day in and day out to operate within a failing system, and why I jumped at the chance to help Jon and Dan launch this book. We'll hear from Jon and Dan in a moment, and they'll set the scene and guide us through the conversations with our guests. But first, a tiny bit of housekeeping. As we just noted, we're recording the event tonight, and we'll make the recording available online for those that couldn't be with us. And also, please use the Q&A or chat function to submit questions throughout the event. There's a Q&A later in the event, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. First, though, let me pass you over to someone who you will all be familiar with, Shami Chakrabarti, from her campaigning work as Director of Liberty to her more recent work as the Shadow Attorney General, and now as a Labour peer. Shami has been an outspoken and inspirational advocate for human rights, civil liberties and justice throughout her entire professional career. Shami provided the foreword to the book, and we're absolutely delighted that she's joined us to provide the foreword to its launch. Shami, thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. And first of all, congratulations to Dan and Jon for this truly wonderful, wonderful book. Congratulations to Bristol University Press on a work of scholarship that reads like an incredibly accessible work of advocacy. It looks like it, it reads like it. I hope that we will be able to promote this book via all our networks. Wonderful to see a puff on the front from the secret barrister and so many commendations of this work on the jacket and within. I think we've been needing in the movement that this book represents and articulates, we've been needing a book of this kind for a very long time. And it's wonderful that it's done. It couldn't be more timely or necessary, but it is a scandal that we need it. The attack on access to justice, for want of a better phrase, is ideological. It is deliberate and it is ideological. Now that's firstly because austerity is always a choice. It's always a decision, an ideological decision made by the powerful, a decision as to how resources are shared or not shared in the world, who is entitled to the things that we all take for granted. And the pandemic has been a wicked modern day parable of the way that structural inequality works in our world, but also of the interconnected nature of society. So it's ideological because of the attack of austerity, but it's particularly ideological when you attack people's ability to access all other rights and freedoms, or even simply to protect themselves from abuses of power wherever they come. And there's no doubt in my mind that governments, I'm sorry to say this, of all stripes, have at times been ideological in their attacks on the fat cats and the gravy train of legal aid, etc., etc. And of course, you know, when you're in government, challenges to the state are irritating. And if you're easily irritated, you can respond in a way that you may come to regret later on. But of course, there are now so many people who have practically no access to legal aid at all. I think Jon and Dan suggest about 20% of people still have access to civil legal aid. The scandal in the criminal justice system is well documented almost on a daily basis, but the civil system is unsung, untold, and that's that's a reason why this book is so very important. My job is to be short but emphatic, as I've tried to be in the foreword that I had the real privilege to write for this book. All other laws, all other rights and freedoms, whether they're social and economic on the one hand, or civil and political on the other, all other laws and protections in our society may as well be a dead letter in a sealed book if people have no access to advice and representation. And it is an absolute and perfect recipe for abuses of power, which have been so well documented in this wonderful work of scholarship, reportage, and yes, advocacy. And we shouldn't be ashamed of advocacy. And Jon and Dan have interviewed so many people working at the sharp end and the coalface of this eviscerated system, but also the people who suffer so much in our terribly unequal society and need legal help and representation. And this intersects with every other injustice in our society today. The Daniel Blake scandal, the Windrush, the real Daniel Blake scandal, I should say, the way people are treated in the benefit system, Windrush, Grenfell, it goes on every day. And we now have a government that actually wants to challenge judicial review itself and clip the wings of even the basic rule of law, and indeed has the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights that has been a paltry safeguard, perhaps, but sometimes the only safeguard that these desperate people have had. So I'm sorry to be a little bit bleak, but I don't want to be bleak. I want to be encouraging. I want to say I am an activist lawyer first and foremost. I don't consider those dirty words, whatever Priti Patel says. And I want ultimately this book to be a call to arms for so many of us in the movement, but also I want it to open people's eyes, and I want it to have the widest readership possible. And with that, I will stop for the time being and let you hear from the actual experts who deliver the work in desperate circumstances day after day. And of course, Jon and Daniel, who have done us all such an enormous service in the work that is justice in a time of austerity. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Shami. Really appreciate that. And thanks for your brilliant forward. Really, it's really great. Over the course of 12 months, Dan Newman and I interviewed people as they went through the justice system. Between October 2018 and 2019, it was a year defined by austerity. And we're going to introduce you shortly to some of the people we met on the way. One of our ambitions for the book was to kind of reframe the debate about access to justice. And we wanted to convey the human experience of those on the sharp end. Access to justice tends to be conflated with legal aid. And in the wake of the savage legal aid cuts of 2013, we wanted the research to capture the experience of those who fall through the cracks. Only a minority of the people we interviewed had seen a lawyer. Very few received legal aid. Most would not have been eligible under the narrow terms of the mean test. Even if their case had fallen within the now massively restricted scope of the legal aid scheme post 2013 cuts. So the ambition was to reach those who fell through the gaps and found themselves in the justice gap, to use a phrase. I did the on-location interviews in 12 different parts of the country, roughly one a month. Dan did a whole load of other interviews, approximately 100, and he mapped the legal advice ecosystem in each of those areas I visited. We reckon we interviewed over 200 people over the course of the year. For the two of us, it was just really important where and how we did those interviews. So they were conducted variously in food banks, one in a church hall in one of the wealthiest boroughs in London, another in a community centre in an old magistrates court in the former mining town of Ever Vale. We did interviews in a homeless shelter for rough sleepers in Birmingham, a busy destitution service for asylum seekers in my hometown of Brighton. We spoke to people in waiting rooms of MPs, surgeries, advice agencies and courts. We did not ring up lawyers and ask for case studies. Tonight we have some of the people that we met on our travels So our book is about how a failing justice system compounds inequality and poverty, and how a denial of access to justice can push the vulnerable into full-blown crisis. On a personal note, as a journalist, the first article I wrote about legal aid was published more than 22 years ago. It was about the Access to Justice Act 1999. And then the chair of the Legal Action Group described New Labour's plans for legal aid. And I just should say how great it is to have Shami and Willie Bart with us tonight, but she described New Labour's plans for legal aid as like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Lawyers have been predicting the death of legal aid, throughout kind of my career of writing about it, and I reckon for at least 30 years. April the 1st, 2013, with the introduction of what we call the LASPO cuts, dealt a devastating blow to the scheme. Dan and I argue that the LASPO cuts represent the death of an idea, the final severing of the connection between legal aid and the welfare state. We make recommendations, but we endorse the Brook Commission's call for the Right to Justice Act. So we're delighted to have Willie Bart, veteran champion of the cause, to speak at the end of the event. I interviewed Willie minutes after LASPO was voted through Parliament. He led the opposition to the legislation in the Lords, and we sat in a cafe, and he told me LASPO was immoral, unconstitutional, and just crazy. He said it was immoral to pick on the poor, and I suspect our research will confirm his worst fears. There is, as Shami says, there is cause for optimism. The survival of the legal advice sector against the odds and the emergence of new law centres is nothing short of a miracle. I'm going to hand over to Dan, my co-author.
Thanks, John. Yeah, one of the reasons why John and me came together on this project is that we shared his view that the arguments around legal aid can often seem a little bit technical, a little bit remote. What we're doing here is we're trying to humanise the issues. The project's born from our desire to show the devastating impact of austerity that's already been picked up by Shami, the ability of people to defend their rights of a civil justice system being restricted. It comes from our anger that the state had let down its citizens, and it's getting away with it because too many people don't know or don't care about the full extent of the damage done by these cuts. We all know that legal aid as a topic gets very little public sympathy. Like Shami noted, the narrative has been set on fat cat lawyers and that idea of riding the gravy train. When I think back to the genesis of this project, I was just thinking this week, it came from my being awarded research leave, which anyone at university would know is time off teaching for a year, which is a wonderful thing. Having that freedom was a bit of a privilege. So I had to think of a big project that was worthy of that opportunity. And looking at access to justice under austerity was that project. The title was there right from the start. Justice in a Time of Austerity. It shows what's going on now. It's supposed to be a definitive statement of what's happening in the justice system. I always saw it as being an oral history of legal aid that would change the stories that are told, away from being about fees and about lawyers, to showing the reality of the lives that legal aid can save and the lives that a lack of legal aid can ruin. And I always wanted this to reach outside of academia, because too many academic books just sit quietly on library shelves. It was important that these stories get out there, and that's where John comes in. He's an expert at making justice issues digestible. I always knew him from his brilliant website, The Justice Gap. I'd written for him before. I was always a big admirer of his investigative journalism, his approach to communicating access to justice issues. I think it's fair to say that before this book, most of mine and John's work had focused on criminal justice. We'd both written a lot about the misery that can be caused to people who go through the criminal justice system because of the myriad failings that there are involved. I was probably best known for my work on criminal lawyers, John for his work on miscarriages of justice. And we both talked about the impact of legal aid cuts in the criminal justice system, which are huge, yeah? And they challenge the idea of access to justice in the criminal courts at all. But we shared this idea that the situation in social welfare law might actually be worse again, less legal aid, less access to justice. And we wanted to investigate that because it's not talked about as much as criminal justice. Social welfare law hasn't had its secret barrister moment yet. And so the point of this book, it's not about us, it's about the voices from the front line of access to justice who show what LASPO and years and years and years and years of neglect to legal aid have done to the justice system. Our role really is just to draw out those voices, to make them heard, because for too long people have struggled in silence, both those who go through the system and those who are trying to help them. And we do want to thank everybody who shared their stories with us and gave their time to us, because they make this research what it is. If it's anything like what Shami says it is, it's down to the people who gave us their time and told us their stories. So I hope the book is readable. I hope it does work to capture those stories. Here's the sales pitch part. Part of being accessible is the price. It's available now at a low price of just under 20 quid for the hardback. There's going to be a paperback coming out soon, which is even cheaper. And that's, about as low as you can go with an academic publisher. So we have massive thanks to Bristol University Press for helping to make the book affordable, hopefully meaning more people can read it. But generally, thank you to Bristol University Press for being a dream to work with. We should also say thank you to Cardiff University, to Ashurst, to Garden Court, who all funded this project. Thank you to LAPG for hosting this wonderful launch this evening. I'm going to shut up in a minute so we can get on with the main event, which, just like the book, is not about us. Okay, it's not just me or John prattling on for an hour. It's about the experts from the front line. It's about their experiences and their expertise. We're going to introduce our speakers in roughly the order you'll find them when you read the book. And of course, you will read the book, won't you? Our speakers are all people we interviewed for the book, and they all, in one way or another, are dealing with those who fall through the cracks after LASPO. So, John, do you want to get us going with our first guest tonight?
Right, just unmuted myself. Sorry, I've had to change rooms because I had problems with my internet, but now I am back. And I'm going to introduce Simon Mullings. Simon was the first person we met on our research in October 2018. And we started with Simon for a reason. Simon was a housing lawyer, and he was on the duty scheme in Stratford Housing Court in Newham, East London. When I spent the morning with him, I mean, it was a quiet day. There were 12 repossession cases on a list that can stretch to 20, but it was a very memorable day. Simon, can you tell us what a housing duty solicitor does and what is at stake for those people that you help?
Yeah, thanks very much, John. And also thank you, John. Thank you, Dan, for having the idea of this book, because I think the idea of getting out there amongst practitioners and, more importantly, their clients is just, as all three of our speakers now have said, just very, very important. Yeah, so a duty advisor to Housing Possession Court is somebody who basically will represent any tenant or borrower who has a possession case that day. Pre-pandemic, some of the busy courts would list up to 40 or 50 cases in a big block list. And a duty advisor could expect to advise and represent between about 10, 15, my record is 23 people in a day. It's pretty knockabout law. I'll tell you that. There are no fine points of case law argued. It's very quick. Sometimes it's very brutal. But as duty advisors, we do the best that we can to get to try and save people's homes. Basically, that's what we're all about.
We say in our book that it's hard to think of a court process where the stakes are higher in a sense, and yet the notion of access to justice is more imperiled. Can you tell us something about the randomness of the duty solicitor scheme?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, the fact that people are not getting advice earlier than when I see them or when my colleagues see them at court ought to be a national scandal. But everybody on this call will know the reasons why, and they have the initials LASPO. Although the situation before that was not as it should be. But yeah, I mean, we are a sticking plaster remedy. We get adjournments, so we get cases put off to the future so that people can try and improve their position and try and save their home. Occasionally we get we'll get cases dismissed, and then we have saved a home, and that's a really great result. A lot of the time we can't. The law is structured such that for many people, through no fault of their own, they get to a position where Even the judge's sympathy won't help them because the law is stacked against them. And I just want to say that that's been the case after the pandemic, during the pandemic and after the pandemic. It remains the case now, which seems to me, again, yet another national scandal, that in a time where people couldn't go to work, you know, all of the problems that the pandemic has brought about, there still remained law on the statute books which gave a judge no discretion as to whether somebody stayed in their home or not. And that is absolutely scandalous. Ministers had every opportunity to temporarily, if need be, but to temporarily change the law in that regard, give judges the opportunity to, you know, to use their discretion, decide whether people should stay in their home. That opportunity was not taken, and that's an outrage.
Can you tell me about the impacts of the pandemic? When we spoke last week, you were telling me about how kind of there's a very immediate impact of the pandemic you noticed in the court. Can you just explain that?
Yeah, well, just for people on the call. So me and John spent the morning together, partly in this 3-meter cubed room in Stratford Magistrates Court, no windows, no ventilation. And usually it's fine. You just need a room to see people in, take their instructions and work out their case. Spool forward, John, to March the 20th, 2020. And I'm in that same room, and it's the end of the day. And a gentleman comes into the room, hands me his papers. I recognize the name and I think, oh yeah, I've acted for this guy before. And I remember it's a really difficult warrant case. So this is somebody who was just about to be evicted by the bailiffs, and we got him a bit more time on the last occasion to stay in his home. But he had things that he had to do in order to try and convince the court that he should be allowed to stay in his home. The case had come back to court. He turned up, showed me his papers. I have a quick look at his papers, look up at him, and I see that he's sweating quite profusely. And I say, oh, are you okay? And he goes, yeah, well, I've just been sweating all the time. I've got this sore throat and I can't stop coughing. And I just think, oh, okay, all right. This is March the 20th, 2020. I know where we are now. Suddenly there is ticker tape, there's barrier tape everywhere. I'm put behind barriers in part of the waiting room of the court. He's put around, the barriers are put around him. Nobody can go near him. Nobody can come near me. Still represented him, still saved his home, still got the warrant suspended, but that was that. And then by Monday, the possession proceedings were no more until September. All possession proceedings were stayed between March 2020 and September 2020. I don't think it was just because of me. I think it might have been a national thing, but that's what happened. Possession proceedings then opened up again in September. But again, I mean, when I was in the waiting room, all kind of taped off, there was a lot of people staring at me, and people wanted to know what was going on. Other punters at the court wanted to know what was going on. Some of them were very angry, and some of them wanted to know, you know, why this guy had come to court. He'd come to court because it was his only opportunity to save his home. If he'd not come to court, he would have lost his home. That would have meant him traipsing around with his family to estate agents or to local authority offices. I mean, he did the right thing. You know, he was limiting his contacts by coming to court, seeing me and getting his warrant suspended. But, you know, what a desperate situation that you know, in the midst of a pandemic, you'd still need to get with symptoms, you'd still need to go to court to try and save your home.
Thanks very much, Simon, and thank you for the work you do. I mean, we spent a lot of time looking at duty schemes, and I think what's shocking it's a safety net, but it's just not a very it's not remotely comprehensive, and it's a very random one. Thank you very much. So some months after we spent time with Simon in East London, we were in Ipswich, where we met Audrey Ludwig, who's director of Suffolk Law Centre. It was then the kind of the baby of the Law Centre movement, the newest member. Audrey, why set up a law centre, and kind of how do you do that in a post-LASPO environment?
Probably because I'm quite mad. Willie will remember. back in 2012-13, when LASPO was being discussed, I put on a conference in our area talking about the fact that we didn't have any legal aid lawyers, and Willie spoke at the event, and it was the first time I said in public, I think we need a law centre. And coming out of the race equality movement, being a Equality Act lawyer, and just seeing what life was like in a legal aid desert made me realise that what few legal aid resources we got would be further decimated. And it was proved to be correct. We had no legal aid lawyer for the population of Suffolk between 2014 and 2019. And it was only because we set up the law centre that we can now say that we've got legal aid housing provision in Suffolk. It was some months after you visited. So the point at which you visited, we hadn't achieved it, and we had to go a very circuitous route to achieve it because we were struggling to recruit. But we did it, and we have done it. We've now got housing advisors, legal aid, we've got a duty scheme going, and all the things we wanted. We've still got lots of gaps. We still don't have any immigration legal aid or public law legal aid, or and the, you know, family law is decimated and the rest of it. But we're making some progress, and there are some green shoots. But you know, that's Suffolk. What about North Yorkshire and Shropshire and Cambridgeshire and Dorset and other places? In some ways, it's fascinating because we're sort of a very good place for you to have visited because we're very ordinary. You know, we're not a big buzzing metropolitan city. We've got pockets of real deprivation, but they're not necessarily the first thing you'd think about when you think of Suffolk. It's a really good place to visit, and it was really interesting to show you around and for you to meet some people, including Trevor Stevens, one of our clients who you featured in chapter 7.
Yeah, tell us about Trevor. I mean, that was very memorable. I think I spoke to him as he was going, literally driving his lorry, where I think he was living in his lorry at that time. Yeah,
one of the areas of work that we focused on is family law and contact with children. And I won't give the story away because I think it's actually worth reading in the book, and you don't want the plot to be told. But basically, Trevor was homeless, living in his lorry in Bury St Edmunds, and a lot of terrible things had happened, mostly to do with the fact that he couldn't get advice, therefore he couldn't get contact with his children. And, you know, he's probably one of those people who is not part of the deserving poor that we all seem to want to help, in this that you know, on paper he doesn't look that attractive, been in and out of prison and all the rest of it, but he was somebody who needed helping. And because of my colleagues who do family law, we were able to help him. And you know, that's something that makes me very proud. We took you to the family scheme at Ipswich Magistrates Court, and we were talking about Ipswich Magistrates Court being like the epitome of austerity justice. Ipswich Magistrates Court is not only a magistrates court where there's criminals, but you have to go, if you go through the waiting room for whether all the criminals and lawyers sit for the criminal cases, and you get to the end, you go to where there's a small, very confined waiting room for family court first hearings. And we've got a little duty desk where we've got volunteer retired lawyers who can give legal information to people who are unrepresented. And it's about 80% of people in the family court are unrepresented. And that waiting room sort of really sums up how grim and unpeople person-centered the process is.
There was a very strange moment as Audrey and I were waiting in the waiting room. There were two other women there.
Yeah.
And Audrey and I were chatting, and I recognised one of the women. I think Audrey did as well. And it turned out she was a family lawyer, and she was a law academic who was in court to look at what it was like post-LASPO and see the experience of litigants in person. And the other woman who was there had a notebook, and she eventually came over to us as we were having an animated conversation about the failings of the legal aid system. and asked if she could ask us some questions. And it transpired she was a Guardian journalist. I think it was Amelia Hill. And she was there to report on the impact of LASPO for, I think it was a front page story. It was a very prominent story in the Guardian. And I just reflect on the chances of actually bumping into a journalist in court interested in legal aid in a year of great indifference from the media about the, what we were writing about was very remote indeed. Thank you, Audrey. I mean, just kind of a final quick question. How do you build a law centre in an environment where, I mean, it used to be typically a law centre would be funded 40% from legal aid and 40% from local authority funding. I mean, you're not going to be able to replicate that model, are you?
No, I mean, and it's really challenging. We get less than 10% of our funding even from our county, because the politicians in our county aren't particularly interested in social welfare issues. So majority of our funding is a mixture of grant funding and a bit of legal aid money. The trouble with legal aid, and I don't come from a legal aid background, so I've got no great love for legal aid other than it's a source of funding and an important one, is that it's not for cost recovery. There's so much of it which essentially you're doing work which you're required to do under contract but is completely unfunded. And the other problem is so many people now are not eligible under the means test, so we end up with a lot of poor clients who are a few pounds over the means test. So in practice at the moment we can't make legal aid pay. We're reliant heavily on grant funding, and it's going to be a struggle. We did this for the journey. We said we don't know whether we'll be a success. We don't know whether we'll be around in 5, 10, 20 years, but think about all the people we can help on the way. I'm not a romantic, but to be frank, you have to be a bit romantic in order to do something as possibly foolhardy as we're doing, but we're making it happen. And we've got to buck the trend, because if we don't do it, who's going to?
We're all very glad you're doing it, and I think you were inspired, you were saying, by Greater Manchester Law Centre, who we also visited as well. Brilliant, thank you very much for that, Audrey.
Thank you.
Dan, do you want to kind of take us on the next part of the tour?
Yeah, sure. So, like John said, at one point, Audrey Suffolk Law Centre was the newest one on the block. Yeah. While we were doing our research, they lost their title for a very short period to a law centre we visited here in Wales, just around the corner from my university, actually, the Speakeasy. And the Speakeasy became a law centre during our research, but it had been there for a lot longer. I was actually there at the 25-year anniversary party where they announced that they were going to relaunch as a law centre. And it was really privileged to be there and hear the stories about, a quarter of a century's worth of help they were providing, and to think about the new journey they were going to take as a law centre. And Warren Palmer, who we're going to speak to now, has been there for I want to make you feel old, but for a lot of that time, since the 1990s, I think. And Warren is the centre director for the Speakeasy Law Centre. He's a solicitor, and he's actually the person I always go to when I need to know something about the advice sector in Wales. He seems to know a ridiculous amount of stuff, so he's always my go-to person. Warren, you've been at the Speakeasy, like I said, for a couple of decades now, but 2 years ago then you made the choice to change things up and become part of a law centre network. Can you tell us, what do you think is the relevance of the law centre movement today?
Thank you. I think that because the landscape has changed so much since LASPO, and even before that, the change to the legal aid for 2010, that law centres are now more relevant and more important than ever. In Wales, to Welsh Government's credit, that some of the effects of LASPO were mitigated by the Welsh Government putting some money into the sector, and in particular supporting citizens' advice, which is great, because it's really good to see that citizens' advice still have provided good service throughout much of Wales, even though they lost a lot of money as a result of LASPO. But there used to be a number of other organisations employing solicitors for social welfare work. The Cardiff Law Centre, which was one of the earliest law centres, closed. I think I probably stopped seeing clients in 2014, although it took a bit longer to wind up. There were two law firms, Morgans and T. Arian, which were devoted to legal aid, and both of those closed. A few more firms continue to do housing work, but they are becoming fewer and fewer. So Shelter Cymru are becoming increasingly lonely as a housing provider in Wales. But the need is obviously still there for solicitors to be involved in social welfare law throughout Wales. There's so many gaps in provision for complex benefit cases, for housing, for immigration, for public law, and other things. That's why I'm really pleased to be part of a steering group, along with yourself, for a new law centre in North Wales, where North Wales has never had a law centre, and there clearly is a real need there. So it's great that should be set up a little bit later this year. Also really pleased that the Public Law Project now has a lawyer based in Wales as well, because so little public law actions are taken here. And that's obviously a real gap. For ourselves, we felt that there were real advantages in becoming a law centre, even though we were set up at the end of 1992. I've been around, I've been working here since 1999. I started my training contract with the Speakeasy here, although I had volunteered for a couple of years before. So I actually do remember my training principal completing green form extension forms, asking for a little bit of extra money for doing an extra 2 hours of work. But yes, we felt that because the landscape changed so much, because the ecosystem is now so fragile, that there were really advantages for us to be part of the law centre's network. Partly, frankly, was to get a bit more recognition for the work we were already doing, because we'd always had employed solicitors. We'd often trained solicitors, including myself, and yet it was easily feel overlooked or dismissed as a small charity with a funny name. And with funding becoming increasingly difficult to get, that was a problem. So the Law Centre brand isn't instantly recognisable, and that's really helpful. But probably more importantly than that, we felt that with everything so fragile that we could do with the support of the Law Centres network of the law centres, and we could learn from them, we felt that we needed to move into new areas of law because other providers had simply been lost. So we've been doing housing law for just a few years, but we still feel there's so much to learn. We've started for the first time last year to employ someone for employment law, but again, we still feel we've got loads to learn. And as part of the Law Centres network, then I feel that we get support there, we can pick their brains, we can get help. So for ourselves, it has been a real help. I do think that there is a real need throughout Wales as well. It's great that there'll be a North Wales Law Centre before too long. I hope that before too long again, there'll be law centres and others providing services throughout Wales.
Thank you. So one of the things that comes out in our book, we talked about quite a lot with you as well, is that the problems of the advice sector in South Wales, as it was across Wales and across England, predated LASPO. We're all talking about LASPO, and LASPO is the jumping off point for this discussion, really. But it goes deeper than that. It was in the previous government as well, in the previous New Labour regime. Can you explain, maybe, especially for maybe younger members of the audience who might think legal aid problems began in 2010, what is the background to this decline, I want to call it that?
I remember just about the green form and having to physically handwrite a form asking for permission to do 2 hours extra work. By the time I'd started, that was changing, and so the early 2000s. Actually, it was probably possibly one of the high points because money was injected into the sector. There were franchises, and there was we were required to become a bit more organised, but actually there was more money, and we, as an organisation, certainly expanded, and I think that was the case for quite a few others. There may have been more problems behind the scenes I wasn't aware of because I was just the solicitor doing the work at the time. But that did seem a relatively good period for legal aid and in our sector. Unfortunately for me, by the time I became the director at the end of 2007, the Legal Service Commission, as it then was, seemed to have grown tired of dealing with so many small, locally focused advice agencies, and wanted to kind of herd us into bigger groups or consortia, or if that was not the case, to give the money that had been funded to us through legal aid and through local authority money to larger commercial outfits who would provide a service instead. So that was the time of the community legal aid centres, community legal aid networks, the clacks and the clans, which did a lot of damage to the advice sector in other parts of England, certainly. And there was a clan, it was planned for Cardiff and Vale, which was on such a scale that really only the commercial organisations could bid for it, and the advice sector, the third sector, would not have been able to compete for that. So that was a real threat, but thankfully for us, Welsh Government again were helpful, and the Minister commissioned a study by DG Legal, and that delayed things and then effectively killed it off. But then by the 2010, the Legal Service Commission was still trying to sort of herd us together and to make us to have consortia covering the whole of local authorities and regions. And I remember endless hours of public meetings and consultations and having to try to get together to put a plan for across whole regions. And the 2010 tender round was a bit of a disaster. Family law one was overturned on judicial review. The social welfare one was not quite as disastrous as family law, but it's still poor. We lost our Cardiff contract. At one point, it looked as though all the third sector advice agencies in Cardiff and the Vale Morgan lost their contracts, although on appeals, thankfully, that was turned around. So by the time of LASPA, we were down to just a small contract in Blaenau Gwent in Ebbw Vale where we were working. And as traumatic as it was, there was an element of relief in not having to deal with so much micromanagement and control. The just downside is dealing without legal aid is just so difficult.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful point to finish on, actually, because something I've often heard doing this research and other research is that some of the amount of work that comes with legal aid increasingly doesn't make it worthwhile doing. You get paid so little, and it's so difficult to actually get that little bit of money, but there's a tiny incentive to actually be doing that work. So just like John mentioned to Audrey, so as a law centre, legal aid is not a big part of what you do now. That people might assume a law centre is going to be chock full of legal aid, but that's not the case, is it?
No.
No, we don't get legal aid at all at the moment. Something we'll have to consider, do we apply again, but because it's difficult without it, but yeah, it doesn't help a great deal.
Well, thank you so much, Ron. And that whole clacks and clans story, it comes out a lot more again. Yeah, buy the book. It's in the book. But I think it's such a fascinating description of just how you can, through the complication of trying to economize and make the system more efficient, you can actually make everything a whole lot worse. And yeah, it really comes out strongly. And the impact that had on the advice ecosystem, to use those terms, in South Wales was devastating. And it played no small part in the loss of what was our previous law centre in Cardiff in Wales. But thank you, Warren. As well as talking to people working in the third sector and the advice sector, as John alluded to, we looked beyond that, because increasingly when there is so little legal aid, when people are struggling, when they have a problem, they haven't got a lawyer maybe they go to. They go to different sources to talk about their issues, to try and get advice on their problems. So we went to food banks, went to community centres. We also talked to MPs. And I've talked to more than a dozen MPs around England and Wales for this book, and all of them told me about how they were seeing increasing numbers of social welfare related cases, stuff that maybe legal aid might have picked up once upon a time, but now was increasingly filling up their casework. And we're lucky to be joined tonight by Dan Carden, MP for Liverpool Walton, and Valerie Beach, caseworker for Dan in his office, and former welfare benefits rights advisor. So thank you both for joining us tonight. Both me and John spoke with you, and we got a real sense for how switched on you were to issues around access to justice. And it was something that we found really impressive. One of the things we wanted to ask you about was, I think it was Val told us about how when Dan first got elected, one of the first things he did was to forge links with the local advice sector. So that's the 2 law centres in Liverpool, the pro bono university clinics. I want to ask, why was that important? Why was that something that you needed to do?
I'll start with that, Dan, if you like. And well, the first thing to say is I represent the most deprived constituency in the whole country. It's the city where I grew up, and it's a city that's been devastated by unemployment for generations, actually. And sort of a once proud city that relied on the docks for much of its life and culture and heritage and employment has had to rely on lots of transient work. And in those first couple of months of being elected, I was determined we would have a shopfront office that was open and accessible to the public. And really, I have to thank my wonderful staff as well, including Val, for really pushing for those links with the law centres. And we've heard the wonderful work that they do, much of it without any funding from government. But they are absolutely key. And I think, to echo the point that's been made a couple of times already, to send me off to Parliament to make laws that my constituents have absolutely no access to makes zero sense whatsoever. And so those links have been absolutely integral. And Val, I know, will talk about some of the specialisms that we've developed, for instance, around children with educational needs and making sure that they get the right to educational and health care plans, which they're entitled to in law. And yet children with SEN are being left without them because there isn't the funding there to do it. So really, it's something that's developed. It's developed through the generosity of solicitors across the city and our law centres, and it's something that I'm thrilled to be able to put my name to it and be part of. And perhaps one other example of, perhaps we can call it kind of MP activism on this is, if you take Pip assessments, I think still we've got 4 out of 5 Pip assessments that go to tribunal being overturned. When the government put the regulations in place, it put the most stringent rules on the ability of people turning up for their Pip assessments, disabled people turning up for their Pip assessments, being able to record those interviews. It said that you had to record them onto CDs or onto audio cassettes. It said you had to provide the private company that was doing the assessments with a copy, so you had to do duplicate recordings. Of course, absolutely impossible. But working with disabled people against the cuts, we were able to buy a double cassette recorder and loan it out to constituents who were going to their Pip assessments so they could actually challenge them. And I think just that kind of ingenuity, working with campaigners and activists, can give members of Parliament a little bit more relevance in the community.
Thank you, Dan. Did you want to pick up, Val? Dan was saying what you might know a bit more about the specialisms.
Yes, thanks Dan and John for inviting us tonight. We're delighted to be in to support the publication of your book. And obviously it's great to see that we're doing a contribution towards this story, because it is a brutal story and it needs to be told. And so thank you so much. Okay, on a positive note, Dan's has built up a fantastic office. I'm not biased saying that, but in our office at the moment now, we've got really good links with the law centres. We've got Vauxhall Law Centre, Merseyside Law Centre, and we deal with Equality and Employment Law Centre. All Also, what Dan did put in place as well, we hold surgeries for parents with children with disabilities. Right away from the beginning, when our constituency office opens, we identified parents coming in, the same problems. You know, time and time again, he'd say, oh, I'm waiting for a statement, or he didn't even know, you know, it was an EHAT, you know, what was the rights or any disability living allowance, nothing. You know, the needs were clearly not being met in the schools, and the schools were saying to the parents, this was happening time and time again. Look, we can't cope with the need. We can't accommodate your children. You need to ask for that. You need to ask for support. And the time delay, the assessments, it was really heartbreaking to see these parents. So Liverpool Law Clinic actually set up a clinic in Dan's surgery. This is organised by the University of Liverpool, and it was really successful before COVID. We've still carried on taking the appointments, but obviously it's not going the same as the way it was, you know, for actually coming in for appointments. It's good that we've now got support, but at the end of the day, unfortunately, the provision is still not being met. The needs and demands and advice are still there and it's still not being met because of the cuts. I'll just say a little bit more about what's actually happening. As Dan said, in the Walton constituency, it is one of the most disadvantaged constituency in the UK. And the cuts, what this has meant for vulnerable people and disabled, that's what they've done. They've targeted these people. They are so vulnerable. You know, it's a really sad state of affairs that people are coming in and asking just for help. You know, we've had homeless people who have been asked to comply with the work condition on universal credit. You know, it's just not good enough. It's just not good enough. And coming to an MP, the amount of work that's coming through on MPs, I've never seen a volume as what we've seen last year. We have people that were coming to us, you know, on 0 hours, people with disabilities, and they felt that in COVID that their employers were using that to target them, to terminate their employment. The problem we had then was getting them employment advice, employment law. A lot of them people lost their opportunity to take that to an employment tribunal because of no access to legal advice. Yeah. Thank you, Dan.
Oh, thank you for that. Absolutely fascinating. Like I said, so many MPs I know are having more and more of this kind of work, but I didn't talk to anyone else who had the same, was building up the expertise in the same way you were in that office to be able to help people in that way. And it's absolutely inspiring to see that, you know, you're having to, so it's not a great situation to be in, but you are reacting to what's going on around you. And like Dan said, that poorest constituency in England, when I was talking to Vauxhall Law Centre, you know, Alan there was explaining to me about all the poverty and all the streets around it. And one of the stories he was telling me was about how, so we often talk about advice deserts, and we mentioned it with regards to Suffolk, you know, being an advice desert. One of the things I got from Liverpool was that even in a big metropolitan city, which from outside you think, oh, vibrant Liverpool, amazing Liverpool, so much going on there. But something so simple as closing a local job centre could completely devastate someone's life, because the next one is 5 miles and an affordable bus journey away. I was absolutely shocked by that. So I think it's really sobering and really important to take on board. But thank you both for giving us that insight into the great work you're doing there to try and to help in a way that you really shouldn't have to help, because the legal aid scheme should be that safety net for these people.
Yes.
You're coming to fill some of these gaps. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Now, returning us to Wales, see me trying to do some sort of fancy link there. It's not that impressive as it's come between two countries, but returning us back to Wales, we spent some time with Hilary Brown in Barry, which is a town just along the coast from Cardiff. Most of you probably know it from Gavin and Stacey. I used to live there for quite a while, and I was very knowledgeable about this woman who we're going to talk to now, Hilary Brown, because she has a formidable local reputation has been an advocate of social justice, of racial justice, for a community worker campaigning and a legal practice, where she's CEO of Virgo Consultancy Services. And I think she's got over 30 years experience in immigration work. So thank you for joining us, Hilary. I just want to ask you a few questions about your practice and what you've seen, if I can. One of the things that always strikes me about immigration work is that back in 2014, the Ministry of Justice said that the immigration process was designed to be straightforward and easy to navigate, and you don't need a lawyer to help you with your case. Now, what do you think of that statement, considering your experience in representing clients?
Well, like many statements that came out from various government departments at that time, it's extremely misleading. You only have to look at the number of applications that are refused and eventually resolved in an immigration tribunal to see that it is not that easy to prepare and submit an application to the Home Office without a lawyer.
And thinking about not having a lawyer, legal aid cuts to social welfare law have had a particularly dramatic impact, I think, in immigration, when you think about how much non-asylum work was taken out of scope. I saw one report from Refugee Action earlier this year, which said that over 50% of immigration asylum providers had gone out of business because of legal aid cuts. Can you tell us a bit about the impact of legal aid cuts on immigration work?
Oh, absolutely. A huge amount of work around immigration is now out of scope of legal aid. And as a result of that, the figures that you talked about, 50% of law firms going out of business, but that's not the full picture. The full picture is even that is still within scope of legal aid. When the legal aid agency comes around and does their audits and reduces what are already very low rates of remuneration by arguing over an excess telephone call that you may have made or an excess letter that you may have sent to a client that has perhaps English as a second language. When you look at the rigors of the audits and re-audits, you can't really plan a legal aid practice at all and build on legal aid rates because, as I say, the audits create huge difficulties for practitioners who are able to identify enough clients to make the business viable, at least on a business plan. But in reality, it's so far removed.
Yeah, thank you. It's such a valuable insight. One other thing I wanted to ask you about, and this week had Windrush Day, actually the day the book was published earlier this week. And you've done an awful lot of work supporting Windrush clients. You've done more than 20 Windrush cases, I think. And like Shami mentioned, Windrush, it's a part of his story of the decimation of the justice system. It interlinks with all these other causes. Considering Windrush and considering what we always talk about with immigration work, the hostile environment, do you think Black Lives Matter within the justice system today?
Sorry, could you repeat that? Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, do you think Black lives actually matter within the justice system, considering the hostile environment?
Well, it certainly doesn't seem as if they do, bearing in mind the majority of negative immigration decisions are against people from countries formerly known as the Empire, now known as the Commonwealth. And it's not a coincidence that the majority of those are Black people. And so it doesn't seem to me as if Black Lives Matter. If you look at the difference between the European legislation and how people coming from the European countries were able to enjoy, and rightly so, free movement and less of a restrictive regime, compare that to the hurdles that people from the Commonwealths were expected to jump. Black lives certainly don't seem to matter in relation to Home Office, UK VI and immigration.
Okay, thank you for all of this insight into immigration work as well, because it's again one of those areas that I think often gets ignored when we talk about the cuts. We will often focus on the cuts around benefits work, but it's has such a dramatic impact, and the issues are so pressing. So thank you so much, Hilary. John, do you want to pick up and ask some questions to Richard and Gail, our final guests this evening?
Yes, thank you, Dan. If anyone has any questions, by the way, do please post them in chat. Questions about the book and the research or directed to any of our panelists would be great. So I met, on our travels took us to Bolton, and I met Richard Wilkinson, Chief Executive, Bolton CAB, and Gail Lyle, Head of Immigrations. And I arrived just after Nigel Farage was in town for the first Leave Means Leave rally. So Brexit was a backdrop to our research, just as kind of austerity was in a way. Richard and I met more than 10 years ago. So I previously visited Bolton CAB in 2011, and it was just prior to the LASPO cuts. And I was interviewing Richard about what the impact of these legal aid cuts was likely to be on Bolton CAB. Richard, could you just tell us what was the difference for Bolton CAB before and after LASPO, please?
Yeah, quite significant was the difference in terms of the ability for us to give access to legal advice. We previously had contracts which gave about 4,000 people a year access to a legal advice specialist, and thus access to the courts. That number dropped to about 800 after the cut. So there's huge swathes of people taken out and not being able to get access to justice that previously were able to. So in terms of the organisation, I mean, there was a significant impact in terms of, obviously there was a large amount of redundancies, but in terms of the other things that would then happen was then we had significant waiting times for people trying to get in. We had a scramble around to try and get other forms of income, other forms of funding to try and enable some sort of service to continue. A lot of the money that was available would be much less focused on giving us the ability to challenge things like the local authority or the Home Office or the DWP, and some of the money was rather more focused on other areas of work, should we say.
So I think you described kind of Bolton CAB as a shadow of itself, which was a theme in a lot of the advice agents that were kind of still present, had kind of survived the changes. And a lot of them have kind of survived the various kind of the legal aid wars from clacks and clans through to the legal aid cuts, but they weren't necessarily the same organisations that they were before. They weren't offering the same kind of service. I think you were seeing roughly the same amount of people, but offering them something different.
We were, yeah. So ostensibly the ability we were often offering one-off kind of advice, whereas previously we'd been able to give the advice plus then effectively progress the client case on their behalf, which is particularly critical in more complex cases around the sort of work Gail does in immigration and community care law and the other subjects we've heard from tonight. So whilst the numbers remain the same, the level of service and the actual access to justice completely utterly changed. And like you said, it was a shadow of its former self. The town changed. We were the main social welfare provider in the town, and thus our diminished resource meant that in the town generally, it meant that things changed. It meant that the local authorities could get away with decisions that they couldn't previously get away with. It meant that homeless welfare, although homeless challenges were still within scope, it meant that lots of areas of that work where we would then start seeing decisions and practices that we hadn't previously seen when there was a significantly sized social welfare law advice provider to kind of keep them honest, if you like, in terms of the decision making.
What about the impact of Brexit on your client group?
So, I mean, there is interesting in this in terms of the whole, the wider context of austerity. And if we think about almost like the changing political landscape, so Bolton is a classic kind of as a red wall stroke blue wall area. In 2015, we had a Labour-run council and we had 3 Labour MPs. Today, we have 1 Labour MP and 2 Conservative MPs, and we have a Conservative-run council, which is pretty astonishing for somewhere like Bolton. Now, along with that, we've also had a range of things that have happened through austerity, such as things like all the cuts we've had, but also things like the hostile environment and all the other things that and the divisiveness that Brexit brought to us. And in terms of, I'm sure many will share this around the table, in terms of then actually thinking about the local social context and the local Brexit politics and the local immigration politics and the views of people, of immigration clients, it's made that significantly more challenged. Things like, for example, we have had instances in the last 4 or 5 years of in the waiting room saying there's too many dark people and why are they getting access to service and we're not. On social media, we'll put out a job for immigration as an immigration advisor and we'll get somebody right underneath. I'll tell the immigrants what to do, kind of things, and then all those kind of things. And so for the staff and everybody working in that environment, it's also that awareness of what's happening out there in the wider context and what that means for service delivery and for clients. Ostensibly, and I think one of the things is that lots of legal aid gave access to the law for groups of people who in some parts of society are now being perceived as kind of relatively unpopular and thus in really vulnerable and really weakened situations. So, I mean, legal aid was a mechanism where people could actually get some sort of social justice. And obviously it's so diminished that in this worsening environment, it's made that situation infinitely worse.
And Gail, could you tell me about some of your clients? I was struck by just how, I mean, one of the things we wanted to do with the book really was to humanize the issue and explain to people how desperate some of the situations are that people end up being in. So, you know, people think of legal aid in a very conceptual way and technical, and it's very remote. But can you tell us, in particular, I was going to ask you about one of your clients, a 32-year-old Albanian woman. Gail, do you mind talking us through that, how you helped her?
Yeah, so she attended her drop-in at the time, and continuing COVID aside, we was open 5 days a week. She attended, she'd recently arrived in Bolton. She came to the UK, she was trafficked to the UK. First stop was Birmingham. Once she was in Birmingham, she managed to escape her traffickers, thank God, approached the Home Office to make a claim for asylum. Now, what generally happens is if someone claims to be a trafficked person, there's a mechanism that kicks in, which it did in her case, but it failed her. What they tend to do is if someone approaches and says, I've been trafficked in this area, they then move them area. So obviously the risk of re-trafficking. With her, she claimed asylum. She then got put in asylum accommodation, also within Birmingham. Now, obviously, you know, gangs kind of, this is a living for some. They would literally wait outside the Home Office, known asylum accommodation. And in her case, she got picked up once she'd moved into her asylum accommodation and re-trafficked. And there's nothing she could have done about it. Luckily, again, second time lucky, she escaped, got moved out of area, dispersed out of area, which is what should have happened in the first place. She came to us, we assisted her with her asylum application and her trafficking kind of application. She ended up with a positive result, but it took a number of years and a number of quite heartbreaking kind of appointments for her to have to relive the experience and not be believed, and then, you know, be refused and then have to go to court, and kind of, it's horrendous what she had to go through. Luckily, she is one of the lucky ones. She got believed in the end, and yeah, moved on, kind of, yeah. But we see a lot of these types of clients.
I mean, can I ask you how she originally came to the UK? Do you mind talking us through that?
She just, so really sad side of this. So her father, this came out later, she kind of disclosed it. So her father became ill. He was diagnosed with cancer. He couldn't afford the treatment. It was then obviously traffickers were working in the area that she lived. She was told that in order, or her father was told, sorry, in order to pay for his treatment, they could take her daughter to a European country. She would work as an au pair, as a cleaner, and the funds would be sent back to him to pay for his treatment. Obviously, that didn't happen. Obviously, the effect on kind of that family unit as well, because she was in this cycle of being trafficked, held against her will, forced to do some horrendous deeds. I think for a long time, until she kind of recontacted her family, she believed she'd been sold by them. So there was a lot of kind of feelings going on there, along with everything else she had to deal with within the immigration system. Unbeknownst to her, like her father, he genuinely, I think, believed that she was going to work and he would get funds to help his treatment. He did it, you know, thinking she was going to be safe. He never dreamed that how she'd end up. But it's not unusual for things like that to happen. And it's sad, very sad.
It was a very kind of harrowing account you gave when I met you. And also when I met you, I remember you saying that the CAB was helping 8 trafficking victims, including 2 children.
Yeah.
And the 2 children had been abandoned at Victoria Station with a mobile phone.
Yes.
And the person just went to the loo, or said he went to the loo, and they were told to press call, and it was the number for the police. It was just, you know, desperate, really, but you know, amazing work that you're doing. And it's, in that case you just talked about, I mean, I'm not quite sure how they ended up at Bolton CAB, how the woman ended up at Bolton CAB. Do you know?
No, I think so. What had happened is she ended up, like I said, in Birmingham, and then been re-picked up and re-trafficked. I think she ended up then up north. Maybe, I think once she escaped again, she went and claimed asylum in Liverpool. Liverpool still have like an emergency accommodation for new asylum seekers, and then they get dispersed out of area. Bolton at the time, and kind of intermittently, is a dispersal area. So it's once she's got into Bolton in that accommodation, the multiple occupancy, and it's obviously we're quite well known in the town centre. There's a big turnover of asylum seekers in that accommodation. The word spreads and people turn up. So that's how she ended up with us in Bolton. It was dispersal.
Thank you so much for going through that, and it's good to see you again, and it's good to see all the speakers again. Really appreciate that. Dan, I'm going to hand over. Have we got any questions?
I think we might be best to move on to Willie now, because we're lagging behind on time a bit. I don't want to have to rush.
We are tight on time, aren't we? Willie, shall we hand over to you?
Can you hear me all right? I've just unmuted.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, just to say, it's been a huge privilege just to be asked to say a few words at this event, but to actually follow the speakers that we've listened to in the last hour or so is frankly just a little bit scary. We've been treated to some wonderful contributions from practitioners, experts, and others who've spoken of their experiences in very moving and memorable terms. And I don't want what I have to say, which will be fairly short, to be some kind of anticlimax. So let me start by saying that, as Shami really said at the start of all this, in my view, this is the most important and significant book written on access to justice over the last 10 years. And why do I say that? Not just because I happen to be on the book launch for this book, although that would be good reason in itself, because there have been other publications, there have been other articles, other books that have very well pointed out the extraordinary scandal, and it is extraordinary, of this last period, the period we're living in now too, in which the right to justice has effectively been denied to millions of our fellow citizens, while at the same time we still like to boast, don't we, to the world at large that we have the best legal system in the world. Those two things don't go together, do they? What this book, to me at least, does is uniquely from first to last to hammer home, and it is hammering home, I think, the argument so that only a fool, and perhaps more importantly, someone who doesn't really want to hear, deliberately doesn't want to hear, can pretend that all is well in this area of justice. It does so by, as we've heard today, combining the history, the facts, with frontline living examples of what has gone so appallingly wrong. As the word's been used a couple of times, and I repeat it, the humanizing aspect of this, which is, I think, crucial to it. All in a way that shocks the reader by its scale and obviously by its importance. If I may say so, these authors take few prisoners. They are absolutely committed to a cause that is both justified and vital to a free society, I would argue, which is the right of every individual to be able to access justice at the time in their lives when they need it. And I ask the question, without that right, how can we say with a straight face that we actually live under the rule of law? That's not to say that I actually agree with every opinion expressed. And I think it'd be a shame if I did, if anybody did. But surely that's a good thing, isn't it? We need to be able to disagree about what's happened in the past and our opinion about what's happened in the past very clearly. What actually matters is that we do agree on the principles, and even more significantly, more important, is still we agree on what is to be done. The authors are absolutely right, of course, that this whole world did not begin with LASPO. Of course it didn't. Or actually going back just before LASPO, a couple of years before LASPO, even the arrival of that government, the 2010-2015 coalition government, that cut across, that had cut access to justice, it should be remembered, within a very few weeks of coming to office, well before the LASPO white paper ever appeared. But frankly, in their desire to make the point, in my view, the two authors are, Jon and Dan, are a little unfair, just a little unfair to the last Labour government, and indeed to Labour, particularly post-2010. So I mentioned four very quick points, and I'd love to be able to talk them through at greater length and hear other people's views. And some are not so important, others perhaps are. First, when Labour actually left office in May 2010, the social welfare law spend was the highest it had ever been. Not nearly high enough, but it's never been, was never higher before, and obviously it's not been higher since. Secondly, just to remind the meeting that Labour did actually change the means test for civil legal aid for the better at the time when the economic crisis was in full swing. Thirdly, and I'd love this to have appeared in the book, I have to say, there was immediate ministerial action, and I mean immediate. It's a thing I'm proudest of, frankly, of anything I've ever done in government, which saved South West London Law Centre from immediate closure. And that was in the face of considerable civil service opposition. But I think it showed the fact that we saved it meant that our instincts, even if we didn't get it right all the time, and we certainly didn't, were the right instincts. And just look how successful that law centre is as we speak now. And fourthly, and perhaps this gets me more than any, it's when we were in opposition. I don't think it's fair for the book to say that Labour, and I quote, dismally failed to oppose the LASPO cuts. I think that's going much, much too far. Both in the Commons under Andy Slaughter and in the Lords where I led for us, and in secondary legislation, which we also defeated, we actually fought that government tooth and nail on LASPO with some considerable help from some rebel Lib Dems and the odd very brave Tory as well. So we defeated them in the House of Lords on a record number of occasions. Not a great historical event, but just something perhaps for the record as well. But interesting or boring as all that may be, it is to the future, frankly, that I think the book directs us. And that's where we should be looking. It says kind things about the excellent low commission volumes, which are very important and are still, I think, very much alive as interesting ideas and more. And adopts the primary recommendation of the commission that bears my name, which it shouldn't. It actually should be called the Brook Commission, after the late and great Sir Henry Brook, who was the leading light on this commission, reported in 2017. And namely, that for the reason that because governments of whatever complexion can't always be trusted in this field, frankly, when the going gets tough, there should be a new Right to Justice Act, which would codify and supplement existing rights, and crucially, would establish a new right for individuals to receive legal assistance without costs that they cannot afford. And going along with that, obviously, as I think most people listening to this will know, the proposal is to establish a new and independent body to promote, develop and enforce that right. And it would be called, certainly in our commission report, the Justice Commission, which would what? Prepare statutory guidance, would monitor compliance, would challenge infringements through the courts if necessary, and lastly, and very importantly, in my view, intervene and assist where necessary in court proceedings. This act, if passed by Parliament, would put justice in the category currently enjoyed by health and education. And what possible reason can there be for not doing that in a country which prides itself on being subject to the rule of law and having justice that's available to everybody? So the author's support, quite strong support, I think, in chapter 10 is highly, highly welcome and very significant, I think, too. No one is saying that the Commission's proposals are perfect in every detail, but as a way of ensuring the legal rights of citizens are protected, surely, I would argue, it's the way forward. And I'm delighted that the book does so too. I do think more discussion needs to be had quite urgently, not just in universities where it's vital too, but in the real world outside. I'm not saying university world isn't real, but outside universities, we need to discuss this proposal, I think, quite urgently and now. So just to finish off, if I may, in my view, this is a welcome and vital book. And I do think, Shami said this at the start, and she's dead right, it's the duty of all of us who've been privileged enough to be at this book launch today to ensure that it does reach a wide and influential audience quickly. All too often, this subject hardly gets a look in what's called the mainstream media, whether it's printed, online, or broadcast. That is a scandal in itself, actually. Here's an opportunity to begin to change that, I hope. Let's determine, all of us who are on this call, whether speakers or not, to actually talk about this book a bit. Let's talk to people about it. Let's give copies to our colleagues. Let's do that. And let's restart this debate so that politicians of all persuasions can't just put this on one side and pretend it's not an issue that doesn't exist. Make them sit up, make them take notice. Now, I'm sure Shami and I will do that where we sit. Dan obviously is doing it in the House of Commons, but it needs wider than us, frankly. And it actually needs to be much more than just one political party. This needs to be something that people agree on, as it used to be across the field. So really, in conclusion, congratulations to everyone involved, from authors to publishers, to the LAPG for putting this on. But let's use this book to remedy what is in fact one of the major scandals, in my view, of our time. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Willie. Thank you very much for that. Really appreciate that. And I'll take on board some of those points. We have to leave at 6:30. The call has to end. I'd just like to thank Shami, Willie, all the panelists, all the speakers, and everyone who kind of helped us with our research. I mean, from my point of view, and I think Dan's point of view, it is the idea of a broken justice system. It's almost a cliche. Every commentator seems to buy into the idea. We have Lord Chancellors who've endorsed the idea, but nobody talks about the crisis in legal aid that we're talking about, which is the crisis over social welfare law. It's a massive omission on the part of the media, on the part of politicians. So, we hope that this is a corrective and kind of somehow gets that profile raised. Dan, do you want to?
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you for everyone who's attended tonight. It means the absolute world to us. Just thinking about what Woody said, I obviously fully endorse buying copies for every member of your family, everyone who comes to do work on your house. Buy them all. There'll be amazing Christmas presents. But no, really, that idea of getting this conversation going, I think, is absolutely key. We all know these issues. We know this is important. But it's about spreading the word further, because there's so much misinformation, there's so much innuendo around legal aid that I think that's the most important thing we can all do, is to go out there and have these conversations to let people know the reality of what's going on around them, which they might not realise unless and until it happens to them, and at which point it's too late. So I think that is the thing to take away, is these stories, inspiring stories, which people have told us tonight and which are in the book, should be the basis of the conversations we have with people around us to spread the word. Yeah, once again, thank you to everybody for being here tonight. I'm aware of the times I spoke a little past, but thank you all. We both really, really appreciate it.
All right, thank you, everybody. We'll end the call there. So a final thanks to all the speakers and to the authors, and for Willie and Shami for joining us as well, and to all the audience members. Good night.
Thank you all. Let's start.